You might be old if growing up in the 1960s doesn't sound like a chapter in a school book, but like the smell of cut grass, gasoline, and something baking in the oven all at once. You might be old if you remember a time when being bored meant staring out of a car window and watching telephone poles go by, not scrolling through endless content. If just hearing that makes something in your chest tighten a little, this one is for you. You might be old if mornings in your memory don't begin with a glowing screen, but with the sounds of a house waking up. Somewhere downstairs, the oven door slams shut, cabinet doors knock softly, and the radio crackles to life with a calm voice, reading the weather and the day's headlines. You could tell what day of the week it was just by the sounds in the hallway. The slow creak of a certain floorboard outside your bedroom door. The way your father cleared his throat before saying the same line he always did. Rise and shine, kiddo. World's not gonna wait. You might be old if you remember when the television was a piece of furniture, not a roommate that followed you from room to room. A heavy wooden box with a thick glass screen, rounded at the corners, sitting on four legs like it had every right to be there. At night, the family didn't scatter to separate screens. You gathered around one. There were only a handful of channels, and you didn't pick the perfect show for every mood. You took what was on, and somehow that made it feel more special. When your father stood up, walked to the set, and turned the dial with that solid click, it felt like an announcement. This is what we're watching tonight. You might be old if you remember what it felt like to wait all week for one program. No recordings, no streaming, no I'll catch it later. If you missed it, you missed it. You saw a tiny listing in the newspaper, or heard your mother mention some special airing, and from that moment the days stretched toward it. When the theme music finally came through that little speaker, you leaned forward without even realizing it. The room dim, the TV glowing, the sound a little tinny, and yet to you it felt absolutely huge. You might be old if you can still recall the smell of a fresh newspaper dropped on your doorstep. Thick, inky pages that smudged your fingers. Your dad would crack it open with a practiced flick of his wrist, the pages making that soft ripping sound at the fold. Maybe you pretended to read the headlines, but you always went looking for the comics first, or the sports, or the little local stories that made your town feel important. Before feeds and timelines, the world arrived every morning in a neat stack of printed pages, and you read it at the kitchen table, one crinkling sheet at a time. You might be old if you remember when the telephone had an address of its own inside the house. It didn't live in your pocket. It lived on a little table in the hallway or on the kitchen wall. A solid, heavy rotary phone with a coiled cord that always managed to knot itself. The sound of the dial returning after each number, tick, 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 was its own kind of music. Phone calls weren't private by default. Someone was always within earshot, stirring something on the stove, folding laundry, pretending not to listen. When the phone rang, it wasn't background noise. It made your heart jump because it meant news, a voice from far away, something happening. You might be old if you remember making plans and then simply showing up. No text an hour before, no live location, just Saturday at 3 o'clock in front of the corner store. And then, on Saturday at 3, you were there. If your friend was late, you waited. You kicked at the sidewalk, watched cars go by, and every person who turned the corner could be them. That waiting, without distractions, without confirmation, taught you something about trust. When people said they'd be there, most of the time, they were. You might be old if you remember the feeling of sliding around on the back seat of a big American car with no seatbelts on. Vinyl seats that stuck to the backs of your legs in summer and turned icy cold in winter. The windows rolled down by hand, letting in a rush of air, exhaust. You stood on your knees to look out the rear window, or sprawled across the whole seat with your head in your sibling's lap. No one was counting buckles. Safety came from your parents' outstretched arm across your chest at a sudden stop, and from the quiet belief that you'd all make it home. You might be old if Saturday mornings in your mind belong to cartoons, cereal, and nothing else. All week long, television felt like it belonged to adults. News, variety shows, soap operas. But on Saturday morning, for a few sacred hours, it was yours. You'd pour cereal into a bowl that suddenly seemed way too big, drown it in cold milk, and park yourself too close to the TV. Bright colors, loud voices, silly plots, and commercials for toys and sugary snacks that seared themselves into your brain. There was a schedule, and if your favorite show came on at 8:30, you were there at 8:25 waiting. You might be old if you remember what a 1960s classroom really felt like, not from photos, but from the air itself. The faint dust of chalk hanging in a sunbeam, the sharp smell of fresh pencil shavings in a metal trash can, desks with names carved into them, the teacher's footsteps clicking on the hard floor, the chalk tapping the board right before a question. When your name was called, you stood up a little straighter and answered with a yes sir or yes ma'am, because that was just how it was done. You might be old if you remember passing paper notes as if they were top secret documents. A small folded square, no emoji, no GIF, just a few pencil written words that suddenly meant the world. You'd slide it toward the edge of your desk, nudge the elbow of the kid in front of you, hope the teacher's back stayed turned. Each set of hands it passed through tried to look bored, eyes fixed on the blackboard. If it made it safely to its target, you felt like you'd pulled off a heist. If the teacher intercepted it and read it aloud, your cheeks burned, but even that memory is kind of funny now. You might be old if the school cafeteria lives in your mind as its own noisy universe. Metal trays clattering, the squeak of rubber soles on tile, the hum of a hundred conversations bouncing off the walls, milk in little cardboard cartons you had to wrestle open, pizza that was probably not very Italian and definitely not very healthy, but you still remember it as legendary. There was always that one day a week when the menu lined up with your idea of heaven, and you could feel it coming all morning long. You might be old if you remember the milkman as a real person, not just a punchline. Early in the morning, before anyone was really awake, glass bottles clinked softly on the front step. You might have seen him once or twice, cap on his head, crate in his hands, moving quickly from door to door. Sometimes your parents left a note tucked into the empty bottles asking for a little more this week or a little less. The world outside your door didn't feel like a faceless system. It felt like people who had their routes, their routines, and their small part in keeping your house running. You might be old if you remember corner stores that were truly on the corner and truly part of your life. A bell above the door that rang with the same little jingle every time you pushed it open. Rows of candy and bright wrappers, comics on a squeaky metal rack, a cooler humming quietly in the back. The person behind the counter didn't ask for your email or your phone number. They knew your name, or at least your face. Maybe they slipped you an extra piece of gum when your parents weren't looking. That little store wasn't just where you bought things, it was where you felt like you belonged. You might be old if you remember what it was like to drop a coin into a jukebox and feel like you just bought 3 minutes of happiness. The lights around the glass would blink, the metal arm would slide into place, and you would hear that soft mechanical clunk as a record dropped. In a small town diner with red vinyl booths and a counter lined with stools, the jukebox wasn't background noise. It set the whole mood. Maybe you and your friends argued over which song to play, or maybe you watched older kids pick something that suddenly made them look like movie stars in your eyes. For the price of a song, the room changed color. You might be old if you remember the thrill of stepping into a five and dime store and realizing that, with just a handful of coins, you could actually buy something that mattered to you. The aisles weren't endless, but they were full of possibility. Marbles, jacks, yo-yos, little plastic soldiers, coloring books. You walked slowly, weighing every choice because you knew you couldn't have it all. You didn't need 30 options. You needed one that felt exactly right. You might be old if you can still feel the weight of a Kodak camera in your hands and the way grown-ups treated film like treasure. Every picture cost money, every click of the shutter was a small decision. No one took 10 shots to get the perfect angle. They took one, maybe two, and hoped it wasn't blurry when the prints finally came back from the drugstore. Family gatherings meant someone dragging out the slide projector, the room going dark, the fan whirring as images of vacations and birthdays flickered on a portable screen or a blank wall. You didn't scroll through your memories, you sat still and watched them together. You might be old if you remember the quiet thrill of turning off the lights in your bedroom and watching a lava lamp come to life. A simple glass cylinder on a metal base filled with colored liquid and blobs of wax that slowly rose and fell as the bulb warmed everything up. It didn't do anything useful. It didn't buzz with notifications. It just glowed in slow motion, painting your walls with soft color while the radio played your favorite songs. Lying there on your back, watching those shapes drift and change, it felt like the whole world had permission to slow down with you. You might be old if you remember what a real Christmas fair felt like in the 1960s, when the high street turned into a little glowing village for 1 or 2 nights instead of a month-long campaign. Stalls were just wooden sheds and trestle tables, their roofs dusted with real snow, bulbs strung overhead on sagging wires rather than programmable LEDs. Steam rose from paper cups of weak cocoa and chipped mugs of tea as people stamped their feet to keep warm, scarves wrapped twice round their necks. The air smelled of roast chestnuts, cheap mince pies, wet wool coats, and the faint whiff of coal smoke drifting in from somewhere behind the shops. There weren't 100 kinds of anything. One kind of toffee, one kind of fudge, one kind of candied apple that stuck to your teeth and your gloves. Kids craned their necks to see over grown-up shoulders as someone's dad tried to win a soft toy on a ring toss, the stall holder shouting encouragement in a hoarse voice that had known too many cold Decembers. Carols came not from speakers, but from an actual group of singers at the far end of the street, their breath visible in the air between verses. You remember how your fingers went numb inside thin gloves as you clutched a paper bag with a single precious treat inside, and how the walk home under orange street lamps felt longer, quieter, and somehow more magical, because you knew the stalls would be gone by morning, like a little traveling world that only opened once a year. You might be old if you remember what a proper outdoor rink felt like long before winter experience became something you booked online. Sometimes it was a real town rink with boards and lights. Sometimes it was just a local pond or a flooded corner of the park that froze solid and stayed that way for weeks. The cold hit you in the nose the second you stepped out. A sharp, honest kind of cold that made your cheeks sting and your breath billow in thick clouds. You shuffled across rough, scuffed ice with skates that pinched your ankles, the surface full of grooves from 100 falls and wobbly figure eights, not a machine-smooth mirror. Older kids played improvised hockey with no helmets and dented sticks, shouting and laughing as the puck skittered into the shadows. You remember the particular echo of blades on ice, that scraping, ringing sound that carried across the whole park as the daylight faded and the sky turned deep blue. Somewhere on the edge, parents huddled in heavy coats, stamping their boots and wrapping hands around a thermos, trying not to show how freezing they really were. And before you ever made it to the rink, you remember tilting your head back to catch snowflakes on your tongue, letting them melt into nothing, or snapping off long icicles from shed roofs and pretending they were glass lollies until your teeth ached from the cold. It wasn't about perfect selfies or curated moments. It was about red ears, wet wool, numb toes, and the kind of exhausted, happy silence on the way home that only comes after hours of play in air so cold it felt like it might stay in your memory forever. And if you remember even a handful of these things, you might be old. But you're also incredibly lucky because you got to grow up in a 1960s America that moved slower, felt smaller, and stitched itself into your memory one ordinary moment at a time. A world where you learned patience from waiting for a phone call, trust from showing up when you said you would, and joy from simple rituals that cost almost nothing. Screens will never perfectly recreate that feeling, but your mind still can. All it takes is a sound, a smell, or a sentence like, "You might be old if," and suddenly, for a few minutes, you're right back there again.